Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome. Our forums are free and open to the public and occur most Sundays at noon. Our mission is to nurture the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. For more information about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce State Representative Elliott Naishtat. Let me tell you a little about Elliott, although many of you already know him. Elliott is from New York originally, but he's become a naturalized Texan. He's been our state representative for 25 years. He's been a courageous and effective champion of progressive causes in the face of some entrenched opposition, especially lately. Using his well-honed political skills, he's originated and arranged for passage of many bills, over 300, providing funding for public health and other human services programs. He sponsored many bills protecting the civil rights and safety of a variety of vulnerable citizens groups. Some of his greatest accomplishments have been the passage of the Nursing Home Reform Act and the Medicaid Simplification Act, both greatly needed. He'll be telling us his life story. I also want to mention a few more of his accomplishments. It's hard to, I can't go on and on for hours, so I'm just selecting some of the highlights. He's received awards from organizations including AARP, the American Foundation for the Blind, the American Cancer Society, People First, Common Cause, Sierra Club, Equality Texas, Texas Council on Family Violence, the Texas Public Health Association, the Texas Freedom Network, Texas CASA, and Texas Legal Services Center. In 1999, he received the Public Elected Official of the Year award from the National Association of Social Workers. He's both an attorney and a social worker, a wonderful combination. In 2002, he received the National Consumer Health Advocate Award from Families USA. And in 2015, he received the President's Lifetime Achievement Award from the Corporation for National and Community Service. He's been named Legislator of the Year by the Texas Apartment Association and one of Texas' outstanding public servants by the Consumers Union, Public Citizen, the Gray Panthers, and Texas Citizen Action. We are so grateful to Elliott for his public service to all of us and his dedication. So, again, it's my honor to introduce State Representative Elliott Naishtat. Elliott?
Thank you all for being here on a beautiful Sunday morning. After I made the decision to not seek re-election, which was one of the most difficult decisions of my life, 7 good people decided to run to succeed me. Each one of them told me that they would never run against me. But if I chose not to run, they would jump in because they would love to serve as a state rep. Gina Hinojosa was one of them, and she surprised so many people. She ran such a strong campaign that against 6 other competent, qualified, passionate pretenders to the throne of House District 49, Gina Hinojosa won without a runoff. So there's no runoff and no Republican file to run in November. Maybe they were thinking that I would be the Democratic nominee again. I don't know. But so Gina will take the oath of office on the second Tuesday of January in 2017. along with 149 other members of the House and 31 members of the Senate, and I won't be there. I won't be there as an office holder elect. I'm not sure where I'll be. But I did want you to know that people, including myself, are so excited about Gina Hinojosa. When I made the announcement that I would not be seeking re-election, I said that I had gotten to know several of the younger people who were interested in serving and succeeding me. And in that letter that I sent out, I emphasized that I have no doubt but that the people of District 49 will be well represented, that District 49 will be in outstanding hands, and Gina Hinojosa is going to make that happen. So a lot of people are curious as to how somebody from New York City ends up speaking to them as a member of the Texas House of Representatives. And by the way, I look around and I see at least 5 people in this room who could probably get up here and deliver my speech. They've heard it so many times. But I also see maybe 3 of you who have never heard it. And when I gave a similar speech at the Travis County Democratic Party Johnson, Benson, Ann Richards Gala about a month and a half ago, I looked around and I said the same thing. There were 600 people there, though. I said, I see at least 10 who've never heard this. And then I turned to the Secretary of HUD, Julian Castro, who was the keynote speaker. I was the honoree. And I said, I know that the Secretary of HUD has never heard my presentation. It is unusual. Until I was elected, it was actually written in the Texas Constitution that if you're from New York City, you cannot serve in the Texas House. For viewers and listeners who don't know, that I'm kidding about that. It wasn't written in the Texas Constitution, but it was very unusual. I wasn't born in Texas, and I didn't come here by choice. I stayed by choice. So let me tell you that story, and then I'll talk a little bit about the session and some of the disappointments and a little bit what we're looking for in the future. So when I finished college back in the late 60s, I signed up to be a VISTA volunteer. Many of you know that John Kennedy started the Peace Corps, where people go overseas. Lyndon Johnson, as part of the War on Poverty, started a domestic Peace Corps called VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. There's a little bit of confusion because President Clinton, during his terms, decided he wanted to have his own version of a domestic Peace Corps, and that's called AmeriCorps. So now we have AmeriCorps volunteers and VISTA volunteers serving their country in this country, and we still have Peace Corps volunteers who go overseas. So I signed up to be a VISTA volunteer, and the people in Washington said, we would love to have you serve as a frontline warrior in President Johnson's war on poverty. That's what they said. And then they said, because you're from a big city, New York City, we'll send you to a VISTA project in a big city. And they promised me an assignment in San Francisco. And I went, yes. But you know the government. They lied. And and they sent me to Eagle Pass. This was not funny. We went through VISTA training for about 6 weeks in San Antonio. And what do you do in 6 weeks of training? Well, the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 stipulated that the purpose of all of the programs under the War on Poverty was to eliminate the paradox of poverty in the midst of plenty in this nation. Eliminate poverty. So how do you train 35 young idealistic people from New York City and Los Angeles and Ardmore, Oklahoma? How do you train them to eliminate poverty? Nobody knew. So they trained us to be community organizers. Who's the most famous former living community organizer in this country? Barack Obama. I used to ask that question and say, who's the most famous former community organizer? And some people would say, Cesar Chavez. And others, Martin Luther King. So, training, Vista training, I don't have time to talk about it, but it was very exciting, very dynamic. The speakers were wonderful, and they focused on community organizing, eliminating poverty, and implementing this concept which became controversial called maximum feasible participation of the poor, which meant that low-income people had to be involved in every aspect of what community action agencies, Vista volunteers, did. And the boards of directors of the community action agencies, not just in Texas, but throughout the country, this was a national program. Low-income people had to comprise at least a majority of the members of the boards of directors. So that meant decision-making authority, how to spend money, whether or not to bring in Vista volunteers, who to hire and fire. It was the board of directors controlled by low-income people. That was one way that maximum feasible participation of the poor was being interpreted and implemented. So, on the last day of Vista training, 6 weeks in San Antonio, Texas, and the whole time I was there, I was saying, I can take it. I can be in Texas for 6 weeks, because then I'm going to San Francisco. Being from New York City, I didn't have a whole bunch of information about Texas, but a lot of us back then weren't enthralled with Texas. Why, you might ask? Well, that about a year before that, maybe two, a guy named Charles Whitman had killed a whole bunch of people from the tower of the University of Texas. We knew about that. We knew that John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, and we knew about the emphasis in this wonderful state on cowboys and football. We knew about the University of Texas. So, and I had heard of a place called Big Bend National Park. So on the last day of Vista training, the director pointed to 6 of us, and we were all from the East Coast, and we had all been promised assignments with Vista in either San Francisco or Portland, Oregon. And the director pointed to us and said, "Oh, you 6, there's been a change in the plans. You're not going to be on the West Coast. Tomorrow morning you'll be on a Trailways bus from San Antonio, Texas to Eagle Pass." And we thought he was kidding. We thought it was a joke. We waited for him to say, "Just kidding, just kidding." The next morning we were on a Trailways bus from San Antonio to Eagle Pass, Texas. And it honestly felt like it took about 3 days to get there. It took 6 or 7 hours. And the bus went down Interstate 35 and then hooked right and south on Highway 57, heading toward the border. And it went for hours and hours and hours. There were lots of people on the bus driving on Highway 57. We didn't see many people at all. I'll tell you what we saw, and I write this down because I can never remember, and it's so incredible. What we saw driving down was hardscrabble, desert, cactus, tumbleweed, shrubs. We did see some armadillos and some javelinas and something called road runners. And that was pretty much it. And the bus went for hours and hours and hours and hours. And finally, on the outskirts of something, the bus stopped and everyone got off except the new recruits, the Vista volunteers. So I went to the bus driver and said, "Excuse me, sir, we're supposed to be let off at the downtown Eagle Pass bus station." And he looked me in the eye and said, "You putting me on, boy?" We had arrived. So, for those of you who don't know, Eagle Pass is on the border, across the Rio Grande from Piedras Negras, Mexico. Back then it was about 13,000 people. And the Kickapoo, who now have a reservation and a gambling casino in Eagle Pass, lived in cardboard boxes under the International Bridge. They've come a long way. I got calls the next couple of days from friends in New York and family who said, "Tell us about your training's done. Tell us about San Francisco." And I would say, "Well, I'm not in San Francisco. I'm in Eagle Pass in Maverick County in South Texas, across the Rio Grande from Piedras Negras," which translates Dorothy. That was November, but I'll talk about summer in a few minutes. Across the Rio Grande from Piedras Negras, Mexico, which loosely translates into Black Rock or Black Pebbles, to which all the relatives and family who called me said, "No, seriously, how's San Francisco?" The next day, the first full day, the director of the Community Action Agency, the Winter Garden Tri-County Community Action Agency, serving Dimmitt, Zavala, and Maverick counties, Diane Martin, took us on a tour of Eagle Pass, which didn't take very long. We ended up in a low-income neighborhood, a barrio. Today they're known as colonias. This was called Seco Mines. Seco means dry, no water, no sewers, no plumbing. And there were about 30 or 35 homes there. And this was a very, very poor neighborhood. And the homes were okay. They were clean. They were very low income. But they looked fine. Either behind or next to every one of those homes was an outhouse, a real functioning outhouse. And I remember thinking, you didn't join the Peace Corps. You're not in Togo in West Africa. You're not in El Salvador. You're in the United States of America. There are no outhouses in New York City. Well, except maybe a few in Brooklyn. No, that's a joke. Some of you may have relatives in Brooklyn. But it was a major eye-opener for me. It was hard for me to believe. So the year in Eagle Pass, I've done a lot of writing about it. It was a game changer for me because I learned about poverty and I learned about low-income people and families. We tried to implement that concept of maximum feasible participation of the poor, and this was happening nationally. So, for example, with respect to the people in Seco Mines, we would meet with them. It was interesting. First time we met, I think about 12 or 13 people from Seco Mines came to the meeting, and I said, so we're from all over the country, and we went through training in San Antonio, and they trained us to be community organizers. And we're not supposed to impose our white middle-class values on you. We're going to do a needs assessment, and you're going to tell us what you would like us to try to help you get, and we're going to try to involve you because we're here for 1 year, and then we leave, and if we don't develop local leadership potential through involving la gente, the people, to the greatest degree possible in planning and developing and running these programs, then we will have failed because you need to know how to do it after we leave. And I said, okay, so we're going to pass out, it was about a 12-page needs assessment. And I started to pass them out, and this very old man, I don't know how old he was, but he said he was born in Mexico, but was a United States citizen and lived in Eagle Pass in Seco Mines. He said, what is this about a needs assessment? And I said, well, that's what we do to find out what you would like us to help you get with your involvement. And he said, well, we don't need to do a needs assessment. And I said, well, sir, you do. I just went through VISTA training. I'm a trained community organizer. And he said, I don't care what you are. We don't have to do a needs assessment. We need the agua. We need water. We need plumbing and sewers. And he said, if you can help us with the agua, then you're welcome. We will work with you. If not, he said, go back to Queens. So in order to try to help people from different neighborhoods in Eagle Pass, and again, this was happening all over the country, we had to make demands on the local elected officials because they're the ones who can apply for grants and make this happen. And in South Texas and throughout Texas and all around the country, a lot of the local elected officials didn't like the idea of outside agitators like me from New York City coming down to places like Eagle Pass. What? Yeah. Okay, Bonnie wants you to know that you were a VISTA volunteer. She wants you to know that she was with the United Farm Workers in the Valley. And this program was happening all over the country. So the story goes that the elected officials in Eagle Pass and Maverick County, that the county judge, Bob Bibb, got so upset with people like me and the other Vistas marching on City Hall, ultimately, after sending nice letters, but getting rejection. Elected officials didn't like that. So the story goes that Judge Bob Bibb called his good longtime friend, Lyndon Johnson, and said, Lyndon, you got to get this guy, Elliott Naishtat, out of here. He's from New York. He's stirring up the people. He's an outside agitator. And actually, as a result of that happening in South Texas and all over the country, this was a national program. Elected officials lobbied Congress, and they changed the law a little bit so that low-income people wouldn't be able to totally control the community action agencies. They changed the law so that local elected officials, if they wanted to, could control the program. If they wanted to let low-income people control it, fine, but it was up to the local elected officials. So I don't know the numbers, but I would guess in about 75% of community action agencies across the nation, the local elected officials took advantage of that change in the law so that they would control the flow of federal funds through the state to Maverick County and not some poor people. And again, this was a national program. So one day in the summer in Eagle Pass, and it was really hot. Dorothy, I don't know if you would remember, but what a lot of us wore in the summer in South Texas, it was my uniform, so to speak. Sandals, cutoffs, torn T-shirt. My hair was longer. It was really hot. And in that part of town, out El Indio Highway, the people said they wanted a preschool program, a Head Start program, under the mantle of the War on Poverty and community action programs. A lot of great programs were authorized: Job Corps, Neighborhood Youth Corps, Legal Services, Head Start, VISTA, Community Action, other good programs. And Lyndon Johnson made all this happen. Lyndon Johnson is one of my biggest heroes. So they wanted a Head Start program, and we helped them organize with maximum feasible participation from community people. And it was great. There were about 30 or 40 kids in the backyard of the house that some of the VISTA volunteers were renting. It was a great program. So on that day, there were several VISTA volunteers and community people, and a car showed up. And none of us had ever seen it. It had government decals on it, and and Hispanic man none of us had ever seen, all dressed up in a coat and tie in the middle of the summer in Eagle Pass. He got out and walked up to the gate in the driveway and was just looking over and looking out at 35 or 40 kids and me and community volunteers. And he opened the gate and walked up past the kids and walked up to me and just started laughing. Just laughing out loud in my face. It felt like it went on for a few minutes. It probably went on for 30 seconds. And I'm looking at him and he's laughing. And I said, "Sir, is this a problem?" We had no idea who he was. "Sir, is there a problem? Can we help you?" He said, "No, there's no problem. Don't get mad." And then he started laughing again. Then he caught his breath and said, "I'm the new program officer for South Texas and West Texas." And he said, "I had to come down to Eagle Pass first. I don't know if Walter hired Gonzalo Barrientos. I don't remember." He said, "I had to come down to Eagle Pass." He's just looking. "I had to come down to Eagle Pass to meet the guy from New York City who thought he was going to San Francisco." He put out his hand and said, "My name is Gonzalo Barrientos." So some of you may know that name. Gonzalo Barrientos became my mentor, served in the House of Representatives, served in the Texas Senate, had a distinguished career in public service. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time on that year. A lot of people say, "Well, what did you accomplish?" And I point them to, I didn't bring it, to a front page story in the New York Times way back then that said, "Poverty eliminated in Eagle Pass, Texas." So I'm going to rush through some of this. After serving the year in Eagle Pass, they made me a Vista leader, and I worked out of San Antonio for a while, and then Austin, where the regional office used to be, the Lowich building on 11th Street. And I went to graduate school at the University of Texas. They had a master's program in community organizing. And I did that, and while I was doing that was when Gonzalo Barrientos in the early 70s ran for the House. The first time he ran, he lost, but he came back 2 years later and won. And I helped organize those campaigns. After getting my master's in social work, they put me on the faculty for a little while, and I ran a legislative internship, which was new for me and for the school. It was the first internship program focused on social work students serving in legislative offices, the first one in the country. This is way before I ran for office. So, and then I went to law school. So several years passed, and when I got out of law school, Senator Barrientos had moved over to the Texas Senate, and he called me and said, "Elliott, you remember how we used to ride the range fighting poverty in South Texas?" And I said, "Of course." He said, "Well, you have all these degrees, and I trust you and respect you, and I'm over in the Senate now, and I need you to come over and be my staff attorney, my staff counsel." He said, I can pay you what we paid you when you were a Vista volunteer, but I can get you a parking place near the Capitol." So I did that for 2 sessions. It was very exciting. We worked on elder abuse, dropout prevention. That was when a guy named Mark Seeberger had been forced to drink so much alcohol pledging a fraternity that he died. And Barrientos said, "I want the toughest anti-hazing law." He said, "Elliott, I want you to write every word of that, and I'll get it passed." And he did, and it's still used as model legislation. One day we were over at Schultz's, and some people said, "You know, you ought to run for the legislature," pointing to me. I said, "What are you talking about? You ought to run. You ought to run against the 3-term Republican incumbent in northwest Austin." I said, he's knocked off every Democrat. I'm not going to run against him. They said, well, you'd be good. You've been president of your neighborhood associations and chairman of the Community Development Commission. You have 2 degrees from UT. You've worked for Senator Barrientos. And I said, I'm from New York City. He would accuse me of being a carpetbagger, an outside agitator. I said, I'm an ex-Vista volunteer. He would accuse me of being a communist. I said, I'm Jewish. This is not the kind of candidate you want to take on a Republican incumbent with tons of money who's essentially never lost. So Gonzalo Barrientos said, you ought to do it. You'd be good. You've been a great staff counsel. He said, but 2 things. Don't talk about state income tax. It's the kiss of death in Texas. And more importantly, he said, never mention that you're from New York City. So I ran, and I don't have time to go into the details of it, but I knew I'd have to go door to door. I organized my own campaign because that's all I'd been doing since I left New York was community organizing. All these consultant groups, good people, wanted $15,000, $25,000 to organize and run my campaign, but I thought, I can do it. Campaign, you weren't dependent on polling, social media back then. It was going door to door, and I got over 100 volunteers, and I went door to door, and on the front steps of good people in that part of Austin, I would say, we have a $4 billion projected shortfall, which we did in 1990, and Texas is at the bottom of the ladder in almost every important category of health and human services spending. We rank 48th, 47th, 50th, and I would dramatically conclude and say, and Texas ranks 52nd in per capita spending on alcohol and substance abuse, and they would say 52nd. I go, yeah, we're behind Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. I said, we have to generate $4 billion just to stay at the bottom of the barrel. I said, everything ought to be on the table. Everything on the table. Everything ought to be open for... We have to raise a lot of money. Some of them would say, what about the income tax? And I said, the only way I would ever support a state income tax would be if we linked it to restructuring the tax system in Texas so that the property tax and the sales tax go away or go way down. People would go, okay. I never mentioned that I was from New York City. So all this time, what do you think Bob, I'll call him Bob because that's his name. What do you think Bob was doing? My opponent, the incumbent. Not much. He'd knocked off every Democrat. He had many high-paid consultants. He had some of those big roadway signs with his name emblazoned, re-elect incumbent Bob Richardson. Some of you know Bob. He's a good man. But he wasn't doing much more. So what we think happened was early October of 1990, some of his consultants probably sat him down and said, hey, Bob, you're doing great. You have nothing to worry about. This guy's from New York City. He's an outside agitator. He's a former Vista volunteer communist. You're not going to have a problem, but he's working really hard, and he's got over 100 volunteers, and they're all going door to door, and they've never done that in North and Northwest Austin, and he's generating some interest, some excitement. He's picked up a couple of endorsements. Let's make sure that you get reelected. Let's not blow this. Let's go up on TV. And they did, with a commercial that anyone who saw it still remembers it, and consultants still talk about it. Some people talk about it. It was brilliant. It was a takeoff on the original Pace Picante sauce commercial. So remember, there's a group of cowboys sitting around the campfire eating supper, and they run out of the Pace hot sauce, so the cook brings them some other kind. And one of the cowboys looks at the jar and opens it and smells it and says, this ain't Pace Picante sauce. This stuff was made in New York City. Get a rope. So Bob's commercial, it was brilliant. It started off with the skyline of New York City. And the voice said, New York City? Do you want a liberal social worker from New York City? And then my photo, the Pace Picante jar, appeared on the screen with my photo superimposed over the logo, and they got a look-alike cowboy from the Real Pace ad, and he said, New York City, I'll bet he's for a state income tax. Income tax? Get a rope. So I won by over 10 percentage points and took the oath of office the same week that Ann Richards took the oath of office. That was back in January of 1991. And obviously I served through what for me was the wonderful Ann Richards era, and then the George Bush era, and then the Rick Perry era, and more recently Greg Abbott. I have amazing stories about that whole experience, and that was almost 26 years ago. So I'm not going to have time to go into all of this, but I want to share with you, it has been an amazing roller coaster ride, and during that ride there were many unexpected events. For example, I never would have expected to spend a week in glamorous Ardmore, Oklahoma, with 50 fellow Democrats, and in the process shut down the Texas House and temporarily kill Tom DeLay's obnoxious congressional redistricting bill. I never would have expected to see the Capitol overflowing with orange-clad pro-choice advocates supporting Wendy Davis during her remarkable 11-hour filibuster. I spent much of that time in the Senate chamber behind the brass rail, quietly cheering her on. And I never would have expected to dance a combination of the Jewish hora and the Texas two-step with Governor Rick Perry and 5 Hasidic rabbis in his ornate reception room, holding hands and circling a table with a lit menorah in celebration of Hanukkah. You should have seen the governor's face. So, real quickly, I wanted to mention a couple of bills that were very important to me. Some of you know that over the years I've introduced, I think it's 6 times, legislation that basically would have authorized the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes. And I couldn't even get a hearing on it for 3 sessions, and then when I got a couple of hearings, the chair wouldn't let us have a vote. Again, this didn't legalize marijuana in any way. It set up an affirmative defense so that if you have a bona fide medical condition, cancer, AIDS, multiple sclerosis, and your doctor suggests that you try marijuana strictly for medicinal purposes, you know, we've been trying to help you for years and you have this chronic and debilitating pain associated with your multiple sclerosis. Other states, like 23 now, have legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes. It's illegal in Texas, so I can't prescribe it, but I can suggest, this is the doctor, I can suggest that you try it, and maybe it'll help. So, and if you get arrested, this was the bill that I'm talking about, if you get arrested, then the bill would authorize you to go before a judge and say, Your Honor, yes, I was smoking marijuana, it really helps me. My doctor suggested I try it. I'm not having seizures. And it's good. You can rub it on the oil. You can ingest it. You can smoke it. It has no psychoactive qualities. And a lot of the advocates for medicinal marijuana authorization or legalization said, Elliott, that's not going to help any of us. It's not going to help any of us because it's only authorized for use by children with intractable epilepsy. And I said it's going to help 160,000 kids in this state. I'm going to support it. and maybe we can amend the bill in future years so that it will apply to people with every other type of bona fide medical condition. When Governor Abbott signed it, he stood tall and said, and for those of you who think this opens the door for medicinal marijuana or legalization, it doesn't. This is for a select, special population of kids, and it will help them. But the door is closed. The way I look at it, what this legislation does is tell the people of Texas that cannabis, marijuana, does have medicinal value, and maybe after more study it'll become clear that it can help people with cancer and AIDS and multiple sclerosis. It's called incremental change. Domestic partner benefits. I introduced bills that would have authorized the University of Texas system and the Texas A&M system to offer domestic partner benefits. It's a way to better recruit and retain faculty, staff, even students. And I never got that bill out of the Public Insurance Committee, but I worked on it, and as you all know, last summer or spring, the U.S. Supreme Court authorized legalized gay marriage. So the legislation that I worked on for 5 sessions basically became moot. And sometimes I like to think what I do is visionary, like medicinal marijuana. It will ultimately be the law in this state and the country. And domestic partner benefits, I'm proud of that. I like to think that in terms of incremental change, I've had a mantra for the last couple of sessions, because it's been really difficult for a progressive liberal Democrat to be able to be successful in terms of passing bills. By the way, I did pass over the 25 years about 330 bills, and some of them were good. I'm joking. They were all good, but the session was difficult. I mentioned the mantra that I've had for the last 2 sessions. And the mantra is maintain sense of humor and try to minimize the damage. Maintain sense of humor and minimize the damage. And one day last session, some friends from New York were in the gallery, and afterward we got together, and one of them said, Elliott, for about 15 minutes, it looked like you were walking around the chamber, just mumbling to yourself. I said, yeah, my mantra, incremental change, minimizing the damage. The best example I can give where we tried successfully to minimize the damage. There's so much that we couldn't stop last session, but look at open carry, where of handguns. And the bill as filed had a provision that said law enforcement is prohibited from going up to someone who is openly carrying a weapon and saying, you know, you have to have a concealed carry permit in order to legally carry openly. I'd like to take a look at your concealed carry permit. And the law said law enforcement is prohibited from doing that. So law enforcement throughout the state said, you're tying our hands. You're saying that a prerequisite or requirement if you're going to openly carry in this state is that you have a concealed carry permit, and you're saying we can't ask? And we responded, and were able to amend the open carry legislation as filed to do away with that prohibition. So at a minimum, law enforcement can go up to someone who's brandishing a weapon or just carrying it openly and say, I'd like to see your concealed carry permit. The other one, which was very exciting, was dealing with campus carry. And as you know, people on campuses, faculty, chancellors, students, staff. People didn't want to be able to carry on campus. It was the NRA and a bunch of Tea Party people and Second Amendment folks who said, no, this is our God-given right. And I think it's interesting that all the chancellors, I think there are 6 different systems, and they all came out opposed to campus carry, all but one. William McRaven, who orchestrated the assault and assassination of Osama bin Laden, retired admiral, who's now the chancellor of the University of Texas system. He stood tall. Who has more credibility than McRaven? He said, press conference, he said, we don't need campus carry, we don't want campus carry on our campuses, and I'm opposed to it, as did 4 others. But the chancellor of Texas A&M, and you may know him, John Sharp, he's a friend, he stood up and said, our students at A&M are quite mature, and I have no problem with campus carry. So what we were able to do was that the bill as filed allowed private universities to opt out, to not have to do it, but not public. And the amendment that we put on at the last minute gave presidents of colleges and universities the option, the authority to declare gun-free zones on their campuses. And that was a major step toward minimizing the damage. And as you know, presidents of universities have appointed committees to come up with recommendations on how, say, the University of Texas will implement the authority to designate gun-free zones. It'll probably end up in court, but it helped a lot. Law enforcement wanted that. Universities wanted that. So, for example, in dorms, you won't be able to have weapons, campus carry. In classrooms, you will be able to. And we've had some faculty members leave, resign. But I'm talking about incremental change and minimizing the damage. There are other bills where there were disappointments. We underfunded Child Protective Services. Once again, you read about deaths in Child Protective Services, and the caseloads that the social workers have are amongst the highest in the nation. It ties their hands as far as protecting children, especially in foster care. But let me stop. There are many examples of disappointments this session. We did some good things with water, with transportation. Some people say putting more money into the Border Patrol is good. It's been an absolute honor and privilege to serve in the House, and in addressing issues that affect vulnerable and disadvantaged Texans. That's always been my focus. I sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't, but I never gave up and ultimately passed more than 300 bills. And I just want you all to know that it has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life to serve these 26 years, to work for Gonzalo Barrientos in the Texas Legislature, in this beautiful city that I love so much. And I honestly do leave with high hopes, knowing that my constituents will be in good hands. I believe the best is yet to come for the people of District 49 and the state of Texas, including the wonderful children in the city of Eagle Pass. Now, you got a few minutes for Q&A. Bonnie has a microphone.
We have about 6 or 7 minutes. Richard Halpin.
Thank you so much for your service and your good stories. Tell us how the Democrats are going to retake Texas and how you have hope and good humor about that coming to be.
how to retake Texas?
How the Democrats are going to retake Texas.
Well, that's going to happen. The question is when. If we look at the demographics of Texas, we know that the Hispanic population, that community, is growing at a rate which suggests that the Hispanic, the Mexican Americans, will be in a position to turn Texas blue, so to speak. There were hopes that Wendy Davis and Leticia Vanderpute, there were hopes in some circles that they would win, and that would push up the timeline. That didn't happen. They got resoundingly defeated. And so now people are saying that it could take 4 years, 6 years, 10 years. It will happen, though. The problem so far is that a lot of the Hispanics don't vote. They don't turn out to vote. You know, Leticia Vanderpute lost running for lieutenant governor, ran for mayor of San Antonio, where she grew up, where everybody knows her and really likes her. And Leticia Vanderpute lost the race for mayor in San Antonio, and it's because the Hispanics have not been turning out in South Texas, the Valley, West Texas, and in this case they didn't turn out in San Antonio. But eventually they will turn out. Now, I'm convinced of that because the direction that the state is taking under the current leadership is not geared toward providing important services, benefits, and programs for low and moderate income people. I often say that today, more so than ever, the leadership of this state, and I'm just talking about Tea Party Republicans and a lot of the Republican leadership, not all at all, but many of them don't believe that it's the role of government to do what FDR did with the New Deal, to do what Lyndon Johnson did with the war on poverty. It's just not the role of government. You privatize, you outsource health and human services programs to for-profit human services corporations, and the role of government is to deal with transportation and border security and water issues and criminal justice. And these are all important issues, don't get me wrong, but it's not the role of government to deal with public education. We need to privatize, we need vouchers, even higher education now, and certainly health and human services. So it's going to take a while, but it will change. And again, I say this with respect to medicinal marijuana. It'll take a while, but it will change, and I honestly believe that.
We have another question. We're down to about 3 minutes, unfortunately. Catherine?
This won't take but a few minutes. I've just recently read a wonderful book called Cooking with Molly. Everyone who knows who Molly is, and know that you're a friend of hers. Now that you've retired from the government working for us in that way, why don't you take up Molly's cause and put some fun into this election beside all this crap that's going on?
I will be doing writing. I plan to, next January when I walk away, I plan to go to Barton Springs, which I haven't been able to do in a long time. I plan to get healthy. I've had some health issues, and I'm hoping I can clean out my garage after all of these years. But I'm also going to do some writing, and I'm going to try to write a memoir based on my experiences as the New Yorker in the Texas House of Representatives. The book that you're talking about was written by Ellen Sweets, a dear friend of mine. It's called Stirring It Up with Molly Ivins, and it's a quote cookbook, but it's really about Molly and her friends. But it centers around going to grocery stores and cooking and hosting dinners and Final Friday parties. And it's a great book. And I will point out, and I'm very proud of this, that in that book, Stirring It Up with Molly Ivins by Ellen Sweets, is a chapter. Not a sentence, not a paragraph. There's a chapter in that book called Are you going to eat that? That's the name of the chapter. And it's all about me.
We have about 1.5 minutes left. Do you want to just make a summary statement?
Do you have a question? People have their hands up.
We'll take one last very quick question. Nancy, stand up, please.
I guess I'm just going to say that I am disgusted with the Texas Legislature priorities on open carry. I happen to teach at ACC, versus virtually nothing about protecting children, increasing the budgets for children protective services, and especially in the face of deaths in foster care. And I just wondered, what can be done to make Texas legislators change these? They also increase the budget for highways when, again, we're not getting increases in budgets for children's protective services.
I agree. There's what's going to happen? There's a famous book by Thomas Frank. It's called "What's the Matter with Kansas?" And the book was written 12 or 13 years ago because it appeared, and it turned out to be the case, that the people of Kansas were voting against their own interests, especially low and moderate income people. And the book analyzes that and goes back through the progressive history of politics in Kansas. It's a brilliant book, What's the Matter with Kansas? And I suggest it to all of you because it is so applicable today. There's going to have to be a change in voters' perspective on the importance of voting, and knowing that your interests are often at stake. And I think that we're going to see efforts geared toward getting Hispanics, especially in Texas, more involved, more engaged, registered to vote, and coming out to vote. And
thank you so much, Representative Naishtat. It's been a wonderful hour, hasn't it? Give him a big hand.
thank you.